I never believed in skinwalkers. At least, I didn't before that night. Few months ago, a buddy of mine, Rick, invited me to join him for a weekend camping trip in the mountains. It was a small group, just us and two others. The site was far enough out in the wilderness that there was barely any cell signals, the kind of place you go to escape from the world. We set up camp next to a wide, fast moving stream that cut through the forest, and it was beautiful during the day, with the sun filtering through the trees, casting golden light across the leaves. But the atmosphere shifted as the night fell. The sky went dark, and the air grew thick with weight of silence. I have camped plenty of times before, but there was something different about this place. The woods felt wrong. The whole area was isolated. As the night dragged on, the sound of the forest grew louder, more intense, like they were right on the top of us. We built a fire and sat around it, sharing stories, but even Rick, usually the most outgoing of us, seemed distant. It was like he was watching the trees, listening to something that none of us could hear. As the night grew deeper, the forest around us seemed to come alive. At first, it was just the usual noises, crickets chirping, an owl hooting in somewhere far off, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, something felt off. It wasn't the typical night sound anymore. The woods were too quiet, as if everything was holding its breath for something to happen. I glanced over Rick. He was staring into the shadows at the edge of the clearing, his face pale under the firelight. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just tired, or the isolation was starting to get to him. But then I noticed how still he was. Not a twitch, not even a blink. Hey Rick, I called out. You alright, man? He didn't respond right away, but when he finally turned his head, his eyes were wide, unblinking. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice low, almost like a whisper. I leaned in. What do you mean? Rick pointed toward the woods, toward the shadow, where the firelight couldn't reach. There's something out there. He said, his voice shaking. Something out there watching us. I laughed it off, trying to be calm. Dude, it's probably just a deer or something. We are in the middle of the forest. Maybe a fox even. You have been out here too long. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. The fire crackled and popped, but it did little to ease the tension in the air. Every so often, I thought I saw something move just out of the light at the corner of my eyes, but when I looked, nothing was there. Maybe we should head to bed, I said, standing up and stretching my arms. Get some sleep. We will feel better in the morning. Rick didn't move. He was still staring at the same spot. I'm not going to sleep, he muttered. Not until I know what it was out there. The night dragged on, and no one said much after that. We all huddled close to the fire, our conversations becoming quieter, more focused. I could feel my pulse racing as the darkness crept in. I kept imagining eyes staring at us from beyond the trees, eyes that weren't human. At some point, I lost track of the time. I was half drifting in and out of sleep when I heard it. A loud snap, like a branch breaking under weight. I jerked awake, heart pounding in my chest, my eyes wide. Did you hear that? I whispered, but no one responded. They are still sitting there, but they weren't talking. They were just listening. The sound came again, this time more closer. Rick, I said softly, but when I looked over at him, I froze. Rick wasn't sitting by the fire anymore. He was gone. Rick! I called out again, panic creeping into my voice. The other didn't seem to notice. They were too busy listening to the forest. I stood up and moved toward the edge of the clearing. My feet crunched on the dry leaves, and I winced at the sound. But there was no other noise out there, no replies from Ray, no reassurance from anyone. I moved deeper into the trees, trying not to make a sound. The forest seemed to be closing in around me, pressing against my skin, and every step I took made it harder to breathe. The shadows were thick and natural, like they were alive. Then I heard it, a low, menacing growl, something that didn't belong to any animal. I knew it wasn't the usual sound of coyotes or wolves, anything I had ever heard before. This was something deeper, more dangerous. My heart hammered in my chest as I froze in place, straining to hear through the tension that held my body captive. The sound came again, and this time I could hear something else. Something that sounded like a whispering? No, not whispering. It was someone talking. It was in a language I didn't understand. Low, murmuring, like a voice trying to sound human but failing at it. I took a slow step back, but it was late. I could feel it now. Something was watching me. The ground beneath my feet shifted, and in a flash of panic, I spun around, expecting to see Rick standing there, playing some prank on me. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the shadows, just barely visible, hunched over in a way that was unnatural. It was tall, far taller than any person should be, and it moved with an odd, jerky gait. Its limbs stretched too far, and the way it bent its back made it look like it was part animal and part human. As it took a step forward, its feet making a wet slapping sound against the forest floor. Then it spoke. Come closer. It said in the same strange, deep voice. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was frozen in place, my heart thundering my chest. The figure took another step toward me, the dim light from the fire casting strange, twisted shadows across its face. I could see it now, clearer than ever. Its skin was pale, stretched over its bone, like it didn't quite fit. Its eyes were wide, too wide, almost too big for its face. They glowed faintly in the dark, and I could see the reflection of the fire in them, burning like embers. And then it smiled, not a smile of amusement or joy, but something far worse. A sickly grin that stretched too wide, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth that seemed to go on forever. The air turned cold around me. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble. Come closer, it repeated, but this time I heard it in my head, not through my ears, but in my thoughts, twisting and slithering through my mind like a poison. After a few moments, I snapped out of my trance, my instincts screaming at me to run. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just turned and bolted, my heart pounding in my ears, my feet pounding in the ground. I ran fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the camp. The others were still sitting by the fire, looking confused and tired. But Rick was back with them, sitting quietly. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice normal, like nothing ever happened. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew what it was. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't human, it wasn't even animal. It was something far older, something that had lived in these woods long before we ever set foot in here, and it was still watching us. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We huddled around the fire, too scared to venture into the dark, too afraid to let the warmth of the flame fade away. Every sound outside the circle of the light made us jump, and every shadow seemed to move, creeping closer to us. By morning, the air was heavy, and the sun did a little to lift the oppressive weight that had settled in the forest. The trees seemed darker somehow, as though the night had left something behind, something that hadn't gone away. We packed our camp in a haste, trying to move as quickly as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, following us. As we made our way back down the trail, Rick stayed close to me. He didn't speak, he didn't look at me, but I could feel his unease. When we reached the parking spot, there was no sign of anyone else out there. We were the last one to leave the site. Rick stopped before getting his car, glancing back at the trees one last time. I heard it again. He muttered, his voice barely audible. "What?" I asked, though I already knew. "Last night, after you left, I heard it, the voice." I looked at him. I looked at it, chills running down my spine. "What did it say?" Rick's face went pale. "It said my name, but it sounded like it was your voice." I don't know if I should be sharing this, but after everything I have been through, I feel like I need to get it off my chest. It's been few years since it happened, and I still can shake the images and the sounds or the overwhelming feeling of dread that I have every time I think about it. I'm a wildlife photographer, and it's been my dream for as long as I can remember to capture the beauty of the nature. I have hiked through forests, trekked mountains, and spent night in the wild, all for the love of photography. But what happened in the remote woods was something I could never have prepared for. I still don't know if anyone will believe me, but I swear on my life it was real. It was late autumn when I decided to head into the woods for a few days of camping and shooting. I have been to this part of the forest before, a thick dense stretch of land that few people ever visit. The locals talk about the woods, but they don't often venture in. There is a kind of eerie reputation about it, something that feels off. But as a photographer, I was used to being alone in the wilderness for a long period of time. When I get there, I pitched my tent in a small clearing by a stream, my camera gear unpacked and ready for the next day's shooting. The air was crisp, and the forest had that haunting quiet it always had. The kind where every rustle of leaf seems louder than it should be. I remember thinking how serene it was, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath. I set up my camera, taking shot of the early sunset, the golden light streaming through the trees, and the subtle details of the forest floor, and it was amazing. There's something peaceful about it, being alone with your thoughts and your lens. You know what I'm talking about. As the night fell, I made a fire and sat by it for a while, letting the crackling warmth chase away the chills. The woods around me were dark, the only sound the occasional snapping of a twig underfoot or the rustling of leaves when an animal walking by. But then, around 10 p.m., I heard something strange. At first, it was just a whisper, like a faint voice carried on the wind. But there was no one around. I paused, trying to make sense of it. I cackled it up to the wind, or maybe an animal in the distance searching for its prey. But then the whispers became more clearer. They were soft, unillegible, but distinctly human, as if someone, no, something was calling out from the trees. I have spent enough time in the wilderness to know the difference between an animal sound and something else. So my instincts told me to stay alone. But honestly, I was more curious than scared at the time. So I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, scanning the trees around me. The beam of my flashlight flickered over branches, but the voices stopped, just suddenly as they started. After looking for some time, I told myself I was being paranoid, a common thing for people out in the woods alone. But then I heard it again, closer this time, a low growl. It was an animal like, but not quite there, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I know wildlife, and I have heard a lot of animals over the years. But this was something different, something that didn't belong in the natural. I should have packed up and left right away, but I didn't. I stayed, wanting to prove myself that it was just my imagination running wild. That was the mistake I made. The following hours felt like a blur. I tried to sleep, but strange noises continued, growing louder and more unsettling each time passing by. Something wasn't right about this place. I can't even describe it properly. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling. The air was thick, heavy, and suffocating, like the forest itself was alive and watching me. Every twig snap sounded like footsteps. Every hustle and rustle of the leaves felt like a threat. The forest seemed to alive, too aware of my presence. Around 2 a.m., I finally couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight again and threw on my jacket and decided to go check out the surrounding area, hoping to shake off the anxiety. I walked a bit further from my camp, following the creek, trying to steady my breath, but that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just a shadow moving between the trees. But as I looked closer, my heart dropped. There, standing motionless in the moonlight, was something I will never forget. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and its body was unnaturally thin. Its limb twisted at odd angles, like a person in the wrong skin, but it wasn't humans. And I looked on its head. It had antlers, two big antlers growing on its skull. No way. Its skin was stretched tight over the bones, pale and almost translucent, as it had been bleached by the moonlight itself. Its face was long, gaunt and featureless, except for the eye, those cold, empty, hollow eyes. They glowed faintly in the dark, like a predator's gaze. I froze in place. My heart pounded in my chest like they did never before. The only sound in my ears. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, afraid that any motion would draw its attention. It was standing there, and I was sure it didn't see me at the time, so I didn't want to grab its attention by doing something. I stand there for minutes, watching its movements and try not to make any noise. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the thing turned its head towards me. I didn't know how to explain the feeling that washed over me. It was pure terror, instinctual fear. The hairs on back of my neck stood up. My body screamed at me to run, get the hell out from there. But my legs were frozen, as if rooted to the ground. It was then I heard the voice again, but this time it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from the figure. Come closer, it whispered, the voice chilling and unnatural. It sounded like it was coming from a very thin air, wrapping itself around me, as if it was inside my head. The moment that voice hit my ear, a primal fear took over. I couldn't move, couldn't even think. It was as if my very existence was in its control. I could feel the weight of its gaze, and in that instant, I knew I had to run, or I wouldn't survive the night. I turned and bolted back. I ran without looking back, not caring about the camera and my gear, or anything else. All that mattered was getting out of that place. The woods, once so serene, now felt alive with danger, waiting to swallow me. I could hear something behind me, a presence, moving through the trees. Its breath dragged, unnerving. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and I stumbled, panic blinding me. I didn't know how long I ran, but it felt like hours. But it was probably only minutes. Finally, I reached my tent. My legs burned, but I dove inside my camp and zipped it up. I could still hear the noises outside, soft, creeping like something was just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I stared inside the tent, shaking, for what felt like eternity. The growls, the whispers, and the strange feeling of being watched never stopped. The worst part? If I was just imagining it all, but I knew in my gut that what I had seen and what had been followed me was real. I left the forest the next morning. At first light came through the woods, not bothering to pack up my equipment. It was like the woods themselves wanted me to go from there. After all these years, whenever I close my eyes, I can still see those hollow eyes staring at me, still hearing that voice calling me from the trees. I don't know if I will ever go back to this place. I got my camera equipment few weeks after that happened. The forest guards contacted me. They were collected my equipments and I went there to the office to take my thing from them. There are stories older than I am about a creature that lurks in the dark places of the woods. They called it the Wendigo, an ancient spirit, a monster that roams the forest, always hungry, always searching for its next victim. And now I know it's real too. If you ever find yourself in the woods, any woods, alone, and you feel that something was off and you are being watched, trust your instincts, leave, and don't look back. Please, I don't wish the experience on anyone. I have lived in Hollow Creek my whole life. It's a small town tucked deep into the mountains, surrounded by forests that seem to stretch on forever. The kind of place where everyone knows each other and secrets are hard to keep, or so I thought. It was the winter of 2012 when I learned that some things are better left unknown. I was home from college for the holidays, spending time with my family. You know, the usual small town Christmas stuff. Sledding, hot chocolate, big family dinners, and of course, listening to the same old stories from the older folks in town. The stories always seemed harmless, even a little silly. You know the kind, tales of things that go bump in the night. The one about the old house on the hill, where strange lights were said to flicker in the windows after dark. Or the one about the miner's ghost, who allegedly roamed the woods at night, searching for treasure. But then there was one story that everyone, even the toughest guy in town, whispered about. The one that made people cross the street to avoid the forest at night. The one about the man in the woods. It was my grandma who first told me about him. She had warned me when I was younger, though I didn't take her seriously at the time. She had a way of telling stories that made you feel like the shadows were closing around you, like the air itself was watching. She always said the man in the woods wasn't a man at all. You see him, you run. You hear me? She said, eyes wide with a kind of fear. you only get when you know something you wish you didn't. If you see him, don't look back. Don't even stop blink. Just run. It sounded like something from a nightmare. But when you live in a place like Hollow Creek, you get used to the odd stories. But still, I couldn't shake the unease feeling that came with the stories. I didn't believe in things like that. I thought it was just a silly story, passed down from generations, and nothing more than that. But then, that winter, everything changed. I was 22 at the time, home from college for a couple of weeks. It was a pretty quiet evening. My mom and dad had the usual decorations up for the Christmas, and the house was warm, filled with the smell of pine and cinnamon. It was supposed to be a nice, relaxing holiday, just like any other that happened before. But it didn't take any long for the sense of dread to creep in. It started small. First, there was the way the air felt different that winter. The snow was coming down hard that year, but it was quiet, too quiet for comfort. Normally, the wind would whip through the trees, shaking the branches and causing the snow to swirl around. But that year, the trees barely moved, and the world outside seemed to be frozen in place. I was out at the woodshed one afternoon, stacking some firewood for my mom. It was cold, so cold that you could see your breath in front of you, even though the sun was high in the sky. The snow crunched under my boots as I worked, but everything felt off. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence of the winter. It was a kind of eerie stillness, like something was waiting, watching. I didn't think much of it at first, though I was used to the quiet in these parts. But when I heard it, I stopped dead in my tracks. A distant growl. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but I quickly realized it wasn't. This growl was different, sharp, guttural, and more animal than you could ever imagine. It came from the woods, not too far off from where I was standing. It wasn't like the growl you heard from bears or wolf. The sound was primal. I don't know what came over me, but instead of running, I found myself taking a few steps toward the trees. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my feet seemed to move on their own, drawn toward whatever was hiding in the woods. As I got closer, I noticed the air had changed. It was colder now, almost biting, and the hair on back of my neck stood up. I could feel something watching me through the woods. I didn't want to look, but I had to. My curiosity was overwhelming, and I took one more step into the trees. That's when I saw him. Or at least, I think it was him. At first, I thought it was a man, standing just out of the reach of the trees, almost completely still. I could only make out his shape through the snow and the shadows, but I saw enough to know that he wasn't right. His posture was wrong. The way he stood, it was like he was almost bent. but not quite, as if his body couldn't quite decide whether it was a human or something else. And those eyes were glowing faintly, an unnatural yellow that stood out against the dark of the forest. I froze. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like eternity. The creature, or the man, or whatever it was, never moved, never took its eyes off me. Then, without a warning, it shifted. At first, it just seemed to crouch down, like it was preparing to launch towards me. But as it lowered itself, the limbs began to change, twisting in a way they shouldn't. There was a sickening crack of bones breaking, and I could hear the sound of flesh stretching. My body went into full panic mode, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The thing in front of me wasn't human anymore. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. It had fur now, matted and dark, and its face had elongated, its nose stretching into a snout, sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. Its hands, if you could still call them that, were long, with claws that looked like they could tear through steel. I don't know how I managed to turn around, but something inside me snapped, and suddenly I was running without even thinking about it. I wasn't sure where I was going, only that I had to get away from there. My legs were burning by the time I reached the home. I slammed the door behind me, my chest heavy, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stood there, pressing my back against the door, trying to collect myself, but I couldn't do that. I could hear it outside in the snow, the sound of footsteps heavy and slow dragging through the snow. Then the low growl again, just outside the door. It wasn't loud, but it was close. I could feel it vibrating through the walls of the house. For hours I stared inside, too terrified to even look out the window. I could hear the creature circling the house, its breath coming in ragged gasps, just like mine. I don't know when it left. When I finally worked up the courage to check outside, there was nothing. No sign of it. No footprints in the snow. No broken branches. It was as if it had never been there in the first place. I never told anyone about what happened. I couldn't. No one would have believed me. The idea that something like that could exist, that the man in the woods was real, was too much to accept. But I knew what I saw and what I heard. The old stories, the ones I used to dismiss, suddenly didn't seem so silly anymore. The man in the woods wasn't a ghost or a shadow. He wasn't just some story parents told their kids to keep them out of the forest at night. He was something far worse than I thought. I haven't been back to the woods since that night. I'm not sure I will ever go again. But every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I can help but feel the same dread creeping back. The air grows chill, and sometimes, just sometimes, I hear the low growl, faint and distant, just beyond the trees. I never go past the tree line anymore, and I never will. There are things outside, beyond our imaginations. Hope you guys like this video. If you did, please consider subscribing to this channel. Enable the bell icon so you don't miss new uploads. And also check out other videos in this channel too. Like them and share them. And if you have any suggestions or any improvements I need to make in this channel, please post them in the comment section. Till next time, this is Malayali Wendigo. Bye.